Welcome back, historians. Today we are going to talk about pre-Columbian Mexico and Mesoamerica. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Summer Cherland. Let's start with this word Columbian. What do you think I'm talking about when I say pre-Columbian Mexico? I'm not talking about Colombia, the country in South America. I'm talking about Columbus, the person. But this word Columbian refers to more than Columbus the explorer, right? It refers to the era of Spanish and later European arrival in the Americas. So Columbian Mexico is Mexico after Spanish contact. So before we even begin investigating the history of Spanish exploration and contact and conquest, let's talk a little bit about what existed before Europeans arrived in what they called New World. Let's talk about pre-Columbian Mesoamerica and Mexico. What do you know about Mexico before the Spaniards arrived? What do you know about Mesoamerica, Central America, the top parts of South America? What were the pre-Spanish, pre-European traditions, cultures, and histories of this community and this place that eventually became Mexico and the greater Southwest? I want to start today with this quote from Armando Navarro, who is from UC Riverside's Ethnic Studies Department. Navarro says, quote, "Aztlán is a state of mind for some people. It's a point in history. For some, it's a political place. For some, it's a separate nation. It represents land lost. You are sitting in a city that used to be in Mexico. That gives us a sense of entitlement. This was our land." Think about this quote. What do you know about this term, Aztlán? Have you heard it before? Is it a concept that's already near and dear to your heart? Is it completely foreign? Each of us is coming to this class with a whole different version of perspective. So each of us comes to these learning opportunities with whatever baggage, experiences, trauma, and information we already had. And we arrive at this shared place, but none of us started at the same spot, and none of us will end at the same spot. You're kind of individually experiencing this moment together. So, maybe there's 20 other people in this class. Probably 18 or 19 of them have a different understanding of Aztlán than you do. You may already know a lot about Aztlán. If you have parents who are Chicano revolutionaries or activists or native, right? You may have parents who've talked with you about the concept of Aztlán, or family members or friends, your whole life. Or if you have no connection to any of this, this is a word that is foreign to you. You've never heard this concept. So just take a moment and look at this quote, read this quote. What is Navarro trying to say? What is he describing in terms of Aztlán? And how does it have any connection to our topic today of pre-Columbian Mexico? Take a moment and read the quote, and then we'll move on. Now, before we begin with our lecture, I want you to take a moment to reflect on where you stand today and on your opinions today. So take out a piece of paper or open a Word document on your computer, and you're going to pause the recording in a moment and just write for 1 minute. We're going to start with the quote. "In Aztec folklore, Aztlán was believed to be in northern Mexico, possibly along the western coast, but other accounts put it farther north, perhaps in what is now Arizona, Colorado, and/or New Mexico." So again, remember, some of you don't know what Aztlán is. Some of you have a very good understanding of it. This is a very basic geographical statement that in Aztec folklore, and Aztec is one of those pre-Columbian societies in Mexico, they believed Aztlán was an actual physical place that existed in northern Mexico, but also into parts of modern day America, including Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. So here's what I want you to do. In your opinion, I want you to answer this question, and it's just for you. You're just going to write your answer in a notebook or on a Word doc. How important is it to understand Native history and heritage when learning about Mexican American history and culture? In your opinion, how important is it to understand Native history and heritage when learning about Mexican American history and culture? Pause the recording, write your answer, take as long as you like. I call it a 1-minute write so that you don't think you need to write a whole essay, maybe just a couple of sentences. Answer the question and then come back to the recording. I imagine that by the end of the class, you may have a different answer to this question than what you started with. It's really important to Chicano scholars to understand and emphasize the significance of Native history when learning about Mexican American history and culture. Because of that, a lot of what we do in this class is anchored in that understanding that Native history, Native heritage, pre-Columbian history is just as important as Spanish contact and American conquest. All right, so that's why today we're spending so much time learning about the societies that anchored Mesoamerica before Columbus and Cortez and all of their bands of Spaniards arrived in Mexico. So let's begin with the origins and characteristics of the ancient Indian people of Mexico. Now, I use the terms Indian and Native American or Native interchangeably. This is because I follow what the sources say. So whatever resource I'm citing or quoting from, I typically follow whatever they're using. I just make sure to capitalize both letters or both words. Some of you might be uncomfortable with the idea of using the word Indian because it has fallen out of more contemporary sort of casual flavor or favor. But there are a lot of Native scholars who still employ the terms American Indian or Indian. And so I just look to them to kind of guide me. So that's what I'm using today. So when we talk about Mesoamerica, this is sort of what we're talking about. Kind of the span of Mexico into Central America, modern day Central America. Parts of the northern tips of South America are included as well. But you notice that this map, which is taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica, they really focus on the Mayan zones of influence and the Aztec Empire, Aztec being in orange and Mayan being in green. This is typically kind of what they mean by Mesoamerica, but we're going to cover 3 other societies as well. But I thought this was a really good map to kind of show you the broad stretch of modern day Mexico and the areas we're going to be discussing. So what was happening in Mesoamerica before the Spanish arrived? I think it's really easy for people to just assume that like everybody living in the Americas were just these like backwards, lost nomadic civilizations that didn't have a whole lot of sophistication. That is 100% wrong. Some of the civilizations in Mesoamerica and in modern day Mexico were just as sophisticated and innovative and technologically advanced as the Romans. So we're talking really significant scientific, astrological, and astronomical advancements that these folks had that they don't get a lot of credit for. We're talking about extraordinary developments in human society and culture. Like I mentioned, these organizations and civilizations can rank equally with the early civilizations of Egypt, Mesoamerica, or Mesopotamia rather, and China. Basically, we're going to look into some of these different civilizations. They were typically agrarian, agricultural, some of them nomadic, but as they became more sophisticated, these civilizations were characterized by kingdoms and empires. They built great monuments and cities, impressive architectural artifacts. They were known for arts, metallurgy, and writing. So these are societies that are advanced, they're sophisticated, they're super impressive. And we start to notice patterns, cyclical patterns, so cycling of growth and decline, right? Unity and disunity. And we see that over time. In these slides, I've included a link to I believe this is assigned for the reading, but if it's not, the Britannica site, which really does a good job of giving you lots of images and breaking down these various societies we'll be discussing. Okay, so let's go back as far as we really can, like as far back as we can in terms of native Mesoamerican activities. As far back as we can go is about 7,000 BCE. So when you see the words BCE or BC, That means before Christ or before the Common Era. So typically the Common Era begins at 0. And so when this says 7,000 BC, that means 7,000 years before 0. And we're in the years of 2020s now. So that's 7,000 years before 2,000 years ago. Does that make sense? So 7,000 years before the Common Era, we begin to see the first experiments in plant cultivation. You start to see permanent village farming, and most of this is occurring in the tropical latitudes of South and Central America. So it hasn't quite yet crept into modern day Mexico. We're looking more at like kind of the coastal environments of South and Central America. And the primary crops that were being grown at this time are corn, but it's different. It's maize, beans, squash, chilies, and cotton. What's interesting is that these same things were being grown in North America as well. So the Hohokam, who are living in modern day Phoenix, were growing the same things. They were growing corn, beans, squash, and cotton. So what was life like in early Mesoamerica about 1500 BCE? So now this is, 1500 or 1500 years before 0. Early villagers were weaving things like cloth. They made pottery, and they practiced all sorts of Neolithic skills like carving, woodworking, and architecture, simple architecture. Villages were typically economically self-contained. So you have small villages that governed themselves, and they were typically politically autonomous, meaning they operated kind of individually on their own. There wasn't like a large kingdom or empire governing their behavior. And as far as we can tell, it's tough to know, but they were relatively egalitarian in societal order, meaning people were basically equal. Now, these are assumptions that archaeologists make based on artifacts and oral tradition that's been passed down for generations. That's the basic understanding we have. But I referenced the Hohokam before. For a long time, historians and archaeologists believe that the Hohokam also lived these kind of politically autonomous, egalitarian, sort of utopian lifestyles. And we've actually found that there were maybe more power structures in place than we assumed. So this is what we know, but there's always, room for debate. We start to see significant changes happening in 1200 BC to about 900 BC. Here's what we start to see, and this is archaeologically speaking. We begin to see that larger structures are being built in Mesoamerica, and these include pyramids and big platforms that hold carvings, homes, in some cases like cities or multiple homes. We also see large monumental stone sculptures, and this is when historians begin to think that we're starting to see changes in the simple social and political order. Right, so as you begin to have more promotion of kings and royalty and leadership, you start to see more ornate or kind of overdone things like sculptures. So if you think about like a simple life versus a life that's lauding a king or a ruler, that starts to show you that these kinds of things exist because societies and civilizations are starting to promote or celebrate individuals, which might mean that there's more consolidated power. We see these new developments appearing on the southern Gulf Coast region of what is now Mexico. So as the movement of activity goes north, we also start to see a movement of societal change. Sculptures, like monuments, rendered in a style now called Olmec, are presumed to depict chiefs or rulers. So that's kind of what I mean, is like before there was sort of like pottery and baskets, and now we start to see art that's being done to promote the reputations or the likeness of individual men or rulers. We also see new developments in class structure and politically centralized societies, larger capital towns and cities. So where you used to have these small villages that were self-sustaining, now you start to see larger cities that are like the center of commerce, and the rest of those small villages scattered about begin to continually use and access the city itself. And this Olmec art style becomes really significant and becomes, almost pervasive. And historians use this word climax. They say this era, this 1200 BCE or 1200 to 900 BCE is the first climax, or the first unification in the history of all of Mesoamerican civilization. So it's kind of, one of those basic stories. We have Mesoamerica begins as kind of an agrarian, plant-based, agricultural place where a lot of the power is distributed equally along the countryside, and then it becomes more and more centralized in cities and towns. So who were some of these civilizations? Who were these prominent civilizations of pre-Columbian Mexico? Okay, think about it. It's before the Spanish arrive. We're talking about Mexico and parts of Central America. What do you know about the people who lived there before Columbus and Cortez got there? You might be thinking of the Aztecs. You might be thinking of the Mayan. Very good. Did anybody else come to mind? Well, let's talk about them. Several of these cultures are considered archaeological cultures. That means that they're defined by archaeologists, really, that historians can't access. So historians and archaeologists work together a lot, but archaeologists tend to look more at like ancient history, and historians tend to look at more textual history. So historians deal in written material and language, right? Anything that's exchanged verbally, and we deal with kind of like textual material, things that we can touch, right? Archaeologists also deal with textual materials, but these tend to be ancient. And archaeologists often are the ones who are solving questions about civilizations that do not have any kind of written record, like they didn't pass down their tomes or their histories. So an archaeological culture is one that is defined by artifacts. It can't be defined by like books, because they didn't leave any of that behind. So archaeologists also think that they find these artifacts to represent particular societies. So sometimes they're making guesses about who this might belong to. And like I said, that's typically based on items of artifacts rather than texts. So the very earliest society we can find in Mesoamerica is called the Olmec. Now I want to point something out before I continue, and that is this one. This name, the Olmec, was invented by scholars. It was not chosen by the people themselves. So when we say Olmec, it's not as though Europeans came in contact with the people who called themselves the Olmec and introduced themselves as the Olmec. This is that archaeological culture that I'm talking about, where archaeologists are trying to define a society, and they gave this name Olmec to this population. Just something to keep in mind. We trace the Olmec through their artwork, through their artifacts, and these kinds of stone structures and also other materials that are left behind are what ties these people to this concept or this title of Olmec. We believe they lived in the northern half of Mesoamerica. They lived from about 1200 to 500 CE. Now remember, CE means Common Era, so that's the beginning of zero. So they're about the first, end of the first century to about 500 CE. That's wrong, actually. I think that actually means 1200 BCE. So they lived from about 1200 before the year zero to about 500 the year before zero. This name, like I said, was invented by scholars, not chosen, and it's derived from, so the word Olmec comes from a Nahuatl word, which is in reference to rubber. And you might know this, but Nahuatl is the language that was spoken by the Aztecs. So that word Olmec tended to mean like of rubber or from the rubber. And so scholars over time have adapted this word to this group. We think their primary food sources began as fishing and hunting, though they became more agricultural over time. They may have been the originators of what is now kind of a famous Mesoamerican historical activity, which is the ball game. It was a ceremonial sport played throughout the region for centuries. The Olmec people also built earthen mounds and pyramids, as well as ceramics, and several types of these became common throughout the broad region of Mesoamerica. So even after the Olmec kind of disappeared or moved on or sort of passed into other societies, their artistic abilities continued to be prevalent in Mesoamerica. Because of this, they are often referred to by historians and archaeologists as the mother culture of all future Mesoamerican societies. Teotihuacan is the place where the gods were created. That's a Nahuatl word that means the place where the gods were created. So this is a society or civilization that left behind a great city that the Aztecs later called Teotihuacan. It started from about 400 to 600 CE. So that is Common Era. That's after the year zero. So 400 years after, in sort of the Julian calendar, it's considered like the years of Christ, when Christ was alive. But in more of a kind of a less religious slant, it's just called the Common Era. So 400 to 600, they were considered the second grand civilization of Mesoamerica. And again, that word climax or unification is meant to show that under the Teotihuacan Empire, you had an actual consolidation of power that was then distributed to those smaller villages throughout Mesoamerica. They placed a great emphasis on political and commercial power. Their great city, which is given the same name, is in the Valley of Mexico and an urban center. So for what we think of, over 150,000 people. So that's a huge city for 400 Common Era things. So we think their power waned around 600 Common Era during a time of troubles, which I thought to be kind of an interesting way of saying that. It's a little vague, right? And this was during a time when a number of states and empires began competing for supremacy. So the Teotihuacan only really kind of existed for about 200 years, but they left behind so much that the Aztecs later used that I thought it was worth bringing up. You probably know about the Maya. The Mayan Empire was from about 1800 before Common Era to 900 AD or CE. So that's a pretty significant period of time. That spans about 2,000 years. So that's a pretty long time for the Maya to have been in power. They lived in modern day Guatemala. They were known for agriculture, pottery, hieroglyphs, calendar. Their Mayan calendar is still referenced and used today. And they originated some of our best and still used today math. They had an astonishing amount of impressive architecture and symbolic artwork. And they derived most of their religious and cultural behaviors from the Olmec. Their decline is quite mysterious. We don't know a ton about what happened to the Maya. Perhaps they died off, or perhaps they redistributed into other societies that later became incorporated by parts of the Aztec Empire. What about the Toltecs? So the Toltec you may not have thought of, but if you look at this map, they really had a whole lot of dominance through that same area where the Aztec later claimed power. They were a Nahuatl-speaking tribe, so that same language that ultimately becomes used by the Aztec, who actually held sway over what is now Central America or Central Mexico for about 2 centuries, 10th to 12th century Common Era. Again, that CE could also be AD. The name Toltec means lots of things. It means an urbanite or a cultured person, or literally a reed person, because their urban center Tolan was called the place of the reeds, probably because they used a lot of canal building. So interesting to know that the word Toltec has this reference to being cultured or kind of high class, right? The Toltecs actually sacked and burned the great city of Teotihuacan in 900 CE. So they're kind of the reason for the end of the Teotihuacan Empire in that particular city. And oral tradition, passed down stories, has told us that this occurred under the leadership of the Cloud Serpent. I cannot say that name in Nahuatl, so I will not try, but it's translated to Cloud Serpent. And under his son, who I also cannot say, they formed a number of small states. All right, you know about the Aztecs, I'm sure of it. But if you don't, I would encourage you to look into their history as well as the history of any of these other organizations. We're uncertain about the Aztecs' origins. We know for sure that they kind of began as an agricultural group, but they might have also been quite nomadic, meaning they moved around a lot in northern Mexico. But they arrive in Mesoamerica, so southern Mexico, around the beginning of the 13th century. Now, these dates are all AD, so 13 13th century is essentially 1200 AD after death or common era. So they emerge kind of rapidly and dramatically as the central dominant force in northern and central Mexico. They formed intricate social, political, religious, and commercial organizations that brought many of the region's city-states under their control. So this is just this, I mean, I would love for you to spend as much time as you could possibly on the Aztecs, because how do they go from being this sort of nomadic tribe who's very agrarian, who's building these like, you know, canal-based farming structures? How do they go from being that to essentially dominating all of the individual city-states and villages that are spread out over hundreds of thousands of miles? They came to dominate all those people. They don't really meet their decline until two things happen, and they both have to do with Spanish contact. The first is when the Spanish arrive. There's a very dramatic conquest of the Aztecs by Hernán Cortés, who overthrew the Aztec Empire by force in Tenochtitlan in 1521. So you actually have Spanish invaders and conquerors who murder and massacre and pillage Tenochtitlan, right? You have that. And they robbed the Aztecs of all their earthly possessions, including, you know, pounds and pounds of gold. That gold is still in museums in Spain, even though it belonged to the Aztecs. So think about that. So that's the first way that the Aztecs meet their decline. The second is more significant, but it's not as dramatic. Prior to Spanish arrival in Mexico, but after Spanish contact in parts of the New World, including Columbus arriving in what is today like the Caribbean, smallpox and other forms of diseases started distributing through the New World, or North America, Central America, and South America, and Native people were not immune to European diseases. So just like we've recently experienced kind of this new pandemic, this new virus that none of us had any immunity to, smallpox was like that, but information didn't travel as quickly. So European diseases, primarily smallpox, spread throughout these giant empires like the Aztec Empire and disseminated generations of people. So Spanish contact is what destroyed the Aztec Empire, but one was due to violence and the other was due to illness. So we've covered a lot. I mean, we can go back through, like we've talked about just basic information about Mesoamerica before Spanish conquest. We talked about native agriculture and life in Mesoamerica and some of the most significant changes that happen. We discussed the agricultural or archaeological culture of the Olmec. We looked at Teotihuacan and the Maya, the Toltec, and we ended with the Aztec. So I'd like you to reflect today as our lecture comes to an end and you begin to consider the reading that you're going to do in a few moments. I want you to think about what you've learned, but also what has piqued your interest. So here's another quote. And I come back to this concept of Aztlan and Aztecs and Native American history informing our understanding of Mexican American history. Quote, "The native roots of the Chicano can be traced back to the Aztecs and to other indigenous people in what would become Mexico. Their European roots were introduced by the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, and the complexity of the Chicano is that they are both the conqueror and the conquered." Such a powerful quote. So here's your question. Here's the question I want you to reflect on your own as you begin to look ahead to this week's reading and multimedia. What more do you want to explore about the significance of Native and early Mesoamerican history as you learn about Mexican American history? This is a class about Mexican American history, but we can't discuss any of that until we've learned a little bit about Mesoamerica and Native American history, because it doesn't begin with Spanish conquest. It begins centuries before. All right, I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I look forward to what you think about this week's reading.